Everybody Loses: The Rise of American Sports Gambling and What It Means for Public Health, featuring Danny Funt. Sports betting is everywhere, but what has the rapid expansion of legalized gambling actually cost us? In this episode, journalist Danny Funt joins to discuss his book, Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. Together, we explore how America's sports betting boom has reshaped sports culture, media coverage, public health, and consumer protections. Danny shares insights from interviews with those struggling with gambling, industry executives, researchers, and regulators. The conversation goes beyond financial losses and examines the erosion of sports integrity, VIP betting programs and emotional entanglement strategies, misleading risk-free advertising, weak consumer protections, conflicts of interest between leagues and betting monitors, the normalization of gambling in sports media, and why gambling regulation may require crisis-level consequences. We discuss how gambling problems affect high-functioning, disciplined individuals, challenging common stereotypes and humanizing the issue. This episode asks a hard question. If sports betting continues to expand without stronger safeguards, who really wins?
This is Talking Addiction and Recovery, the podcast talking, you guessed it, all about addiction and recovery. Join your host, licensed professional counselor Andrew J. Schreier, as he and his guests break down recovery topics with raw honesty, delving into niche conversations around the topics of substance abuse, mental health, and gambling. We intend to meet individuals where they are on their own personal journey of recovery, with dignity, respect, and compassion. We'll do more than talk addiction and recovery. We'll explore it. We're glad you joined us. Here with today's episode, your host, Andrew Schreier.
Our guest on this episode is Danny Funt, who is the author of Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. His reporting has appeared in the Washington Post, the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, and the Columbia Journalism Review. He previously worked as an editor at The Week magazine. A graduate of Georgetown University and the Columbia Journalism School, he lives in Charlotte, North Carolina with his wife Sally, their son Louis, and their tuxedo cat Winnie. You can learn more about Danny Funt in the podcast notes. Let's welcome him to the show. On this episode of Talking Addiction and Recovery podcast, we want to welcome Danny Funt. Thanks for joining.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're going to get into your book in a moment, and there's so many questions that I have to ask. But before we do, can you just give a little bit of a background about yourself to the audience?
Sure. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm a reporter. I've been covering sports betting for several years now, mainly for the Washington Post. And that led to this book deal to write my first book about the betting boom and all of its consequences and what's really going on with that industry and why it is everywhere all of a sudden. And I've been very excited by the response it's got. It only came out in January, so it's awesome to hear that you liked it, and I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah, it was a book that I pre-ordered. So not every book is a pre-order. So when I saw this come out, and I was so grateful because in my area as a counselor, gambling hasn't always been the one that has the newest book or
hmm
something, and to see something come out that is not years old or that's so I'm very grateful that we have individuals who are writing about this, talking about this, asking questions to give a lot of us a lot more information that we're not used to having this quickly. So before I we dive into it though, I want to the cover was great. And I have to ask about it because if you notice, people who aren't going to be watching the video except and listening, but on my bookshelf, I have books lined up for upcoming guests so that people can kind of see some of the books that I am reading and guests that are coming up. So I had yours up there, and my wife walked past my office and was like, "Everybody Loses? Like, what is that about?" And of course, I was like, it's about sports betting. And she was like, "Okay, that makes a little bit more sense." So I gotta ask, that title, Everybody Loses, where does that come from? What sort of messaging are we talking about with that? Because it is pretty captivating.
Thank you. That was the hope. It was really a realization that I had after talking with a few hundred people for this book, in all areas, certainly all forms of bettors, people who work in the business, scholars, researchers, you name it. I try to, everyone who has a useful perspective on this, I try to speak with. And I was just struck after doing that at, yes, there's a lot of money being lost as Americans wager more than $150 billion legally every year on sports. But this story is about so much more than money. So I was struck by the lost integrity of sports as there are more fixing scandals and people lose trust in the legitimacy of what they're watching, the lost independence of sports media. As there's so much advertising now, it really makes journalists feel conflicted about, do I do something that'll make my advertisers happy or that's in the best interest of my audience? The lost credibility of politicians, and you might say, how could they have any less credibility? But I do think the way this has all been rolled out and the fact that it's so favorable to the industry and has neglected so many consumer protections is a loss to just the faith that we have that politicians are looking out for their constituents' best interests. And finally, when you think about the consequences for public health, that losing is staggering. And, I've been grateful to speak with a lot of people in recovery for addiction and a number of counselors and psychologists, and just the levels that that involves, again, beyond money, but to people's mental health, to their family relationships, to their jobs. And then, so that is important. And then lastly, at least for now, what this costs our relationship with sports. It fundamentally changes how we engage with sports. Whether, and I don't want to sound moralistic about that or like there's a right way to be a sports fan, but I think it's safe to acknowledge that when people tell me, they can't enjoy sports unless they have a bet on the line now, I think that's a loss. And it's a little complex exactly how, but we could talk about that. But it's just a lot of losing when you think about it from all those different angles.
And there's so many things you brought up that I know I want to talk to you and ask you about with integrity and stuff like that. But that title, I really appreciate it. Coming from my experience as a counselor, I usually talk about how, when you talk about gambling, you can't talk about money, but money is also not everything, that there is a lot of other things that can be problematic and cause issues. And I'm really thankful that you highlighted the losses isn't just money that we're talking about, that there's so many other things that can be impacted because I think we can get hyper focused on the money. We can get drawn into the money. But in that description, there's a lot of other things that by reading your book, people are going to understand is also beyond money as far as the impact. So I really appreciate that. Thanks for sharing that.
I'm glad to hear that. When you bring that up, one person who comes to mind who I think had a really poignant story and perspective on all this is someone who actually used to work in the gambling business. And for a period, he was betting a lot on basketball because he had figured out this angle that made him a pretty profitable bettor. And he spent a couple of years devoting a ton of time to betting. And the angle was effective no matter, it didn't have to be the NBA, basically any basketball game. So he was betting on Chinese basketball and Australian basketball, and therefore finding himself up at all odd hours, worried about how games were going. And he told me, yeah, I ultimately was profitable in the long run, but I lost just so much time. And I also, because he acknowledges he kind of developed a gambling problem as all that unfolded. I lost so much time. And also, he would say, like, it would be time to put my kids to bed and I would, or have dinner with my family. And I would think, well, I could go try to make some money betting, or I could do that. Why not go try to make the money? Or he would put his kids to bed and he would catch himself staring at his phones instead of focusing on them, or pushing a stroller and worried about a score and not, being present with his kids. So that used the word loss as it's just the loss for him was about way more than money. And that, that's sad. And it's an example of when the sports books say, as long as people can afford this, it's okay. As you know, but it's lost on a lot of people. You don't have to be going broke to have a gambling problem. And that fundamental truth is a learning curve for a lot of Americans.
Yeah, when I talk about that in trainings, especially people who've had, little experience with gambling or no real knowledge of it, that the money becomes the central focus, but that doesn't mean that captures everything. So I'm really glad that you talked about all that and how it captures that in the title. I think that's pretty fascinating. And you also mentioned all the people you interviewed. There's so many names in places that as I read this, and I was so grateful. Some of the names I know the people who work in the gambling treatment prevention. There's some that I've had on my own podcast. So it was great to see some of the people that I've worked with that you've interviewed and talked to in this space. So how did you approach all these people from different places, different parts of this, and wanting to interview them? Because there was so many different backgrounds. So what was it like for you to try to reach out or talk to some people about what was going to be this book?
Yeah, there are a lot of books where they'll really force it to be told through one person's eyes just because narratively that can be convenient. I felt like that just wouldn't remotely do this story justice because you would want to hear from a lot of different people with different perspectives. And as a reporter, it's comforting to know, there's no shame in knowing less than the person you're talking to. That's really the whole point. So I was just endlessly curious to talk to people who have useful insights about this from all angles. As far as the, people with lived experience community and counselors and all that, I wanted to just be as respectful as possible and know, I'm not trying to exploit your story just to shock people. I want people to understand that ordinary people go through these problems. Like sometimes we think of this caricature of a problem gambler and, they must be so out of control and so greedy and so reckless in all areas of their life. And, I talk to really smart people who are successful or disciplined and yet have a vulnerability that allowed them to develop a gambling problem. And I thought that was an important story to share. So a lot of it simply came down to I'd like to have a lot of people's, share their side of the story and help them understand what I was trying to accomplish with the book. A whole other category that we could get into is how I got people in the industry to talk to me, because that was a different set of variables to have to navigate. But for most people, it was as simple as, I feel like there's a lot of misunderstandings with sports betting and how things are taking shape. And I'd be grateful if you could help me shed light on.
Were you surprised at how many people wanted to talk about it? Were you anticipating that I don't know if I'm going to be able to find as many people to share about it? Like at the end, where does that land with you as far as the amount of people you're able to talk to, the different backgrounds? Did that surprise you? Is that what you had hoped for? Did that go beyond? Because I can see where no one's going to want to talk about this, but also I can see where it's like there are people who do want to talk about it. So overall, like how do you look at the end result in how many people you were able to talk to from different backgrounds, lived experience, people who were in the profession, who are
Mhm.
operators or former employees? Where does that land with you after publishing this?
I would say there were like three categories of people who I felt different things about related to that. So, as far as people with lived experience, I was surprised that so many were kind enough to tell their story. I felt like there would just be so much shame potentially with that and skepticism of what my motivations were. It's always useful, though, in reporting if someone can vouch for you. So, as soon as I earned the trust of a counselor or, someone with a respected voice. And then they could say, hey, Danny's has good intentions. You can feel comfortable speaking with him. That helped a lot. Also, when people just realized how thorough I was trying to be with this, I think that gave me some credibility. So that was by and large really encouraging and made me happy, just how many people were down to tell their stories in that group. Then I think about people in sports, and I think a lot of them are walking on eggshells and reluctant to say the wrong thing because the business of sports is so integrated with gambling. A lot of their peers might work in sports media and be supported by gambling advertising, and you don't want to embarrass them. It's just in general, I feel like people are watching their words in sports. And that's why when The Athletic recently did an anonymous survey of the NBA of basketball players, they got some really remarkable feedback about how troubled players are by dealing with all of the negatives that come with this of harassment, the temptation for them to gamble, all of that. They were just saying this didn't seem like it was in our interest for the leagues to do the deals that they did. But I spoke with some players, some agents, but on the whole, I wish more of them had been uh, brave enough, honestly, to talk to me. And then the last group is the industry. And I was really encouraged that a lot of people spoke with me. Some of them, I couldn't print their name or I couldn't print a lot of identifying details. And that was understandable because they currently work in at these places that who could expect them to speak out against their employer. But I think it goes to show that they feel um, conflicted about how their business is being conducted, especially when you think of it in terms of RG, like whether the industry can be trusted to self-police in the way that it promises that it can, and that the industry says, oh, no, no, we don't need any outside influence on consumer protections. We have this under control. And I think hearing from people in the industry who said they're not buying that was very powerful. So I spoke with a lot of people under those circumstances or former employees who were uh, brave enough to talk to me. And I'm really grateful for that. And they have great perspectives and might have felt a little bit freer to speak their minds. But I was so disappointed that the industry, in a formal capacity, didn't by and large cooperate with my book. I really wanted to talk to executives at these top companies, even people in RG roles who I thought part of why they exist is to answer questions about RG concerns. So, like DraftKings, there was this huge hoopla when they established a chief responsible gaming officer, the first RG official in a C-suite at a sports book. That person wouldn't talk to me. Really no one at the executive level at DraftKings would talk to me. So I just think I think that's disappointing because there's a lot of questions that people have, and I really wish they had wanted to tell their side of the story. And they chose not to. And I think they'd rather, my book not get much attention because I got people to talk about things that are uncomfortable for the industry.
I really appreciate the all the interviews that I've learned so many different names. How things worked was pretty fascinating when all of a sudden it was like, wait, this company, and then there's this company too that does this and that. Like it was such a I thought things were a lot simpler. And
Mm,
sometimes
yeah.
you kind of help show that there's so much that goes on behind all this. So I really think that all the interviewing you did and the amount of time that would have been and to create that space to ask questions, I really appreciate with lived experience because I've worked a lot in substance use as well, where I've seen people's stories used against them. So
Yeah.
I think with your approach to not wanting that and sincerity and making sure that there's nothing with like an agenda with that. So I do appreciate that approach with it. One thing I wanted to definitely talk to you about, and you mentioned it in the earlier question about the integrity and the impact of the game. And I started seeing this with fantasy sports years ago. So I started noticing like friends would be in fantasy leagues. We'd be watching like a Packer game, Wisconsin, and all of a sudden another player from a team caught a touchdown and they were like, at first they're like, oh, but you know what? That guy's on my team, so I guess I'm
Mhm.
okay with that. And now you add a lot of money into that equation. So I was at a sporting event, an NBA game, a couple weeks ago, and there was a bad call made. Just gonna say it was a bad call if fans were booing. But I can't tell you how many times I heard comments like, well, we know who the refs are rigged for. Oh, we know who the NBA wants to win this game. Oh, they have to, like, never in my lifetime have I heard so many comments now about gambling related at like a live game from like one call. That to me was like this this isn't about just this is bigger than just like someone gambling, but this is also the impact of like how we engage with sports, how people watch sports, how people and I think you put on cheering in the wrong places. You know, it's like
Yeah,
when your team wins, you lose. And
right.
that didn't make sense. So I'm curious with everything that you did talk about, where do you look at those things with how this is changing how people are viewing the game? The integrity was a reason why sports betting was not allowed or like not desired. And then all of a sudden it became a whole switch from one side to the other.
Yeah, that expression, cheering in the wrong places, was David Stern liked to say that, the former commissioner of the NBA. And they had a number of warnings about gambling that sadly they're all proving true. And that was one of them, that you might get more people to watch because gamblers watch more games, but they might not be watching for the same reasons. And they might lose interest in a favorite team or a favorite player and just be cheering for very arbitrary things. I remember, have you come across Rob Minnick?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So Rob is really awesome, and I'm very impressed with the work he does. And I wrote about him partly because we went to the same college, and I just found it striking that when I was there, no one was betting, and when he was there, like 5 years later, everyone was betting, and he developed a gambling problem at the same school. But one thing he told me that stuck with me was once he was in recovery, he went to a playoff basketball game, and these people, he started talking with these fans sitting in front of him, and they lived in Long Island. The game was in Philadelphia, so they had, taken a ferry and a bus and a train to get to this game, and the, playoff basketball tickets aren't cheap either. And the whole game they were just worried about a player on the Knicks getting a steal because that was the prop that they had bet. And Rob was like, "Man, that sounded familiar because I used to think that way, but I'm so happy that's not how I view basketball anymore." And again, I don't want to. People often recoil if you try to make it sound like, there's the proper way of being a sports fan. And, if you, it's not like this is so important. Sports are kind of ridiculous in the first place, and yet we love them. But I do think two things are really changing. One is it's so much easier to fix a game than ever before. And we're seeing the examples of why, because you can make a ton of money on individual betting on individual play. And it's one thing to influence who's going to win or lose a game. But the fact that a bench player could say, I'm going to make sure my props go under, and people can make hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars off that for a game is it's a new reality of online betting. And as people told me who work in sports, or even worse, who work at these integrity monitors, the companies that have to police all that, they said it would just be impossible to stop that stuff from happening, which is why we keep hearing about those scandals. And that just it damages people's faith in sports beyond gamblers, obviously. Like it's a reason why this story is relevant, even if you have never placed a bet in your life. When you see 65% of Americans now think some athletes alter their play to swing the outcomes of bets, that's a level of cynicism that's well beyond some fringe conspiracy theory. And what you were saying about that sort of heckling, it sounds like that goes on almost every game. Players say they hear that constantly now. And it's sad, honestly, because like, why should they be worried about that? Why should, it's not, it's a bummer if people think this is professional wrestling at the end of the day.
I think that's a concern where like that's where I have where you hear people who are saying like as a result, this is all just basically becoming scripted.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
every event or every sport is like basically now because of the money on it, because of who has money to win or lose, because of the partnerships, because of the advertising, because of all this, that there's this idea now that like everything is basically becoming scripted. And then this
Yeah.
is entertainment to watch it. And but all of a sudden it just changes how people are, even if you're right. And I'm glad you said that, even if you didn't gamble, people are noticing that impact, like that of what's going on. So, and you with why wouldn't that be a concern? I'm sure you have some ideas or guesses, but why would that not be a concern to sports leagues, to teams, and maybe to some it is, but not to the point where we're not seeing more of a an alarm from them versus the alarm we've heard from others to say this impact that we clearly can see.
I don't know. I really tried to understand that because it does seem like it's inviting trouble in so many ways. And these are like real problems if people don't trust what they're watching. Like that's the heart and soul of the appeal of sports is believing this is a legitimate competition. I just think the leagues were arrogant and thought they're going to make a ton of money in the short term. They're going to have a way bigger TV audience and people are going to be buying more tickets just because there were studies that showed that gamblers watch a lot more games. And I guess they thought they could deal with the problems. And maybe they thought they could sweep some of the problems under the rug, which is something I get into in the book as well. That's maybe even more alarming than what we were talking about a minute ago, because the leagues have an ownership interest in the companies that are responsible for flagging suspicious bets. And I remember hearing from a few people, but particularly an NBA agent, who told me, if they ever caught a superstar or if they ever caught a game being fixed that was a really prominent game, not just some, there was, if it was a game that really mattered and people learned that that had been corrupted by gambling, that would kill the league. And he said, there'd be so much pressure for them to not let the public ever know about that because of how damaging it could be. So the fact it's just an extraordinary conflict of interest. And that too gives me doubts about what I'm watching, but I don't think a lot of people understand that. They think one of the perks of legalization was it would help them catch improper betting, and that's just not true.
Yeah, I read the I there's usually when there's like some scandal that comes out, I'll notice when there is some quote given back, there's usually like this proves the system actually works
Yeah,
because we
yeah.
caught the scandal or we caught it. And I'm like, that doesn't sound like a win. Like that sounds like a lose-lose. Like like
Well,
that doesn't
yeah,
sound like a
exactly.
good thing.
It's very disingenuous because when a lot of time passes without a scandal, they say, look, all these fears were overblown. And when there are scandals, they say the system is working. I mean, if you're creating a bigger problem and you're occasionally catching more problems that come of that as a result, as you said, that doesn't sound like a win to me either.
Yeah, it's that worries me because then it just also means there's a lot, it's like to me when I work, I'm gonna see if this comparison work. Like when I have individuals who see me for drinking and driving. So I'm a substance use counselor as well, and they see me because they got caught drinking and driving. They get involved in court. They got to go to counseling. I usually tell them like this probably wasn't the first time you were drinking and driving. This is probably the first time or the second time you were
Right.
caught, but a lot of them acknowledge that there was plenty of drinking and driving beforehand. So
Hmm.
to me, like, just because we got them doesn't mean that there wasn't anything happening all the way up until then that was having consequences, impact, and things that
Right.
we don't see. So yeah, whenever I read that, I'm like, this doesn't sound like a good. I don't know if that helped your case by saying this helped us catch the big scandal that was going on. The goal is to prevent it from
From ever
happening.
happening. Right. Right. And often when someone's caught, it's like years after the fact, and you wonder, isn't the whole point so that you can immediately catch it so we don't have to now worry that multiple seasons of games were affected by this? The, and another, that's a great analogy that you just gave. Another one that I throw out in the book is uh, some years ago, the Justice Department got in trouble for they had this idea that they would sell cartels rifles that had tracking devices. And the idea was like, okay, we're going to catch, drug dealers because they're going to have guns that we can trace. And the tracking devices didn't really work. So all you had was just more criminals with rifles. And this feels like that, where it's like we've made it much easier for them to corrupt sports. And the promise of being able to detect that corruption doesn't work nearly as well as we were told.
One thing I wanted to talk to you about, which I haven't learned as much except from your book, was this whole change in status with VIP bettors. And I remember, back in the day with casinos, it was like comp a room, here's a meal. Like there was catering
Right, right.
to people like that. That's not new, right? But how it has definitely changed and how this VIP betting and sports books have gone, which you would think, well, this is an online platform now, this is on your phone, but can you share a little bit about what you learned or just any thoughts you have about that whole area? Because I found that to be something that I don't think most people are aware of, and just how it was going on and just the depths of it and kind of where we're at with it. I think people thought that that would go away because it's not the old style casino
Yeah.
perks. Yeah, so any things you want to share with that?
Yeah, that had to be my favorite chapter because I didn't realize a lot of that stuff either. Even after covering this for a while, it really opened my eyes to how important that side of the business is. I'd say two things are really different from what you were describing of the back in the day when you'd get a steak dinner or a suite or something comped by a casino. One is because these companies have such expensive deals with teams, it gives them access to all of these privileges that require the cooperation of sports teams. Like if you're a VIP who's losing enough, you might get to throw out the first pitch in a Major League Baseball game, or have your kids take batting practice on the field, or play pickup basketball in an NBA court, or give the starting command at a NASCAR race. Oh, I mean, the list goes. I love hearing about that stuff because as a sports fan, it's like, gosh, I'd give anything to get to do that. But that's all facilitated by these partnerships with teams in the leagues. And, most casinos didn't have that, at least with sports betting. So that's new. And the other side of it is that now that this is done online and people are betting from anywhere, it's like yeah, you might have given a certain VIP a car if they're at a certain level, maybe, but the privileges were mostly confined to the casino, right? Like rooms, restaurants, that stuff. Maybe a concert that's being shown at the casino. Now the sky's the limit because it's an online business. So when I heard about like a guy had a bachelor party and the operator paid for a cruise during the bachelor party, or even weirder stuff like at FanDuel, I heard about a VIP host who learned that a client's dog had passed away. And
I remember
so they
that.
sent them this condolence basket that had a picture of the dog on a blanket for them. And the point that they explained was like, we want you to be loyal, not just to FanDuel, but to your specific host. So if you were ever considering pulling back, know that you're going to lose all these perks and you're going to lose this friend you've made through your betting. That feels dicey to me because, it's a strange incentive to lay out there. And also, the host is responsible a lot of times for stepping in if you're showing signs of a problem. And just the fact that you have that level of intimacy, it makes that very complicated and messy potentially, where you don't want to hear it from them if they say, hey, man, are you overdoing it? Do you need to take a break? And also, they just aren't really your friend. They're really there to keep you gambling. So that gives a false level of trust. But so many people who I spoke with in recovery said that at one point they were getting these VIP privileges. And they said, I was hooked on the betting, but I was also hooked on the perks. I heard from a counselor in Connecticut who told me about two clients. One, uh, both of them had postponed getting treatment because they didn't want to give up on their VIP privileges. One of them had been promised that they were going to get a free laptop if they kept betting. The other was going to get free golf clubs. And they delayed getting help and cutting themselves off because they didn't want to lose out on those perks. As irrational as that might sound, because they were probably losing way more money than if they just bought the golf clubs or the laptop. But a free thing just sounds so enticing. The last thing I'll say on this is you hear again and again from these companies that they're vetting VIPs to make sure that they can afford to be losing that much money. The baseline is like losing thousands of bucks a week, and it's often way more than that. And they'll say, okay, if you're going to be losing that much, we'll make sure you can afford to do so. And as we were discussing, affordability doesn't mean you don't have a problem, but at least that's what they're telling the public. And I spoke with this guy in Connecticut who lost 100 grand in a year at FanDuel, and he's now in recovery, but he had a problem. And he said, I was hooked on those perks and it made it so much harder for me to stop. And I was hearing him say that and thinking about these assurances that I had been told that they check, that people have the income or the means to be betting all that. So I said, so when you were at FanDuel losing all that money, what was your job? And he said, I was a server at the Cheesecake Factory making $65,000 a year. And obviously, FanDuel had never made any effort to confirm that he could lose six figures in a year. And it's just sad. And gambling is potentially addictive enough, but to add on all of these privileges that you get as long as you keep losing so much money, and maybe more importantly, betting so often, that is just a bridge too far, as a lot of people see it. And they're like, it's got to be a matter of time before people say the VIP business needs to be reined in.
And I had a Columbo moment when I was reading this chapter where you were talking about like the golf clubs, the throwing out the first pitch, doing that. In my mind, like I'm picturing this VIP person that everyone would look at and be like, well, they must be really important or successful to be able to do these things.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Here's the other side of it. This is where I'm not getting this. They're not having a VIP because they win so much. So like the VIP person is someone that is losing some of the most. But
Yeah.
yet how it's being portrayed or the perks that get offered is it feels like a, a, a magic trick. It feels like a behind the curtain, but like here it presents itself as this person must be successful, they must be doing well financially. Like, this isn't the person who we wouldn't think of having a gambling problem. But the reality is, to be a VIP, you're not winning a lot of money from the company or from like you are losing some of the most, but yet you are looked at as almost this very important person.
Yeah, magic trick is a great way of putting it. And uh yeah, losing is not just a requirement, it's like the first requirement because as someone who worked in the VIP business at DraftKings put it, you basically have to be betting irresponsibly to qualify. Like if there's any discipline in how you go about betting, if you say I'm only going to bet this much in a week or a month, or if I don't feel as confident about a game, I'll bet less. If there's that level of strategy and self-control, you're probably not going to get VIP treatment.
You
And
might
the
lose
best,
it, right?
yeah,
Like,
you might
didn't you
lose it.
talk
Yeah,
about
yeah.
how like even people who were making like smarter bets or being more cautious, like all of a sudden they would lose their status or they would told like you're not. I thought I read something about that in the book
Yeah, yeah.
where
There was one brutal story of a guy in Ohio, and he was at Fanatics, VIP there, and he told his host, I really love the Pittsburgh Steelers. They're coming. I forget if they were playing the Browns or the Bengals, but they were coming to Ohio to play. And he was like, I'd love if you could give me tickets. And they were like, absolutely, we got you. Fast forward to a few days before the game, and he's like, hey, can't wait for the game. Could you throw in a parking pass? I realized I could use that as well. And very casually, they were like, unfortunately, we had to revoke the tickets because your recent betting is not in line with what we want to see from our VIPs. He hadn't broken any rules, hadn't done any of the tricks that people use to win. All he done was place sharp bets on football. And that was enough to get him not just disqualified as a VIP, but to have these perks revoked in such a cold-blooded way. I could only imagine how bummed out he would have been to go to the game and go to the will call window and then say, "Yeah, not your name's not on the list, man. Sucks. Sorry." That's what Fanatics was going to put him through for no other reason than he was placing smart bets.
there was a question. Not there'll be a question, but I think one thing your book did a such a great job of, which is what I struggle with, is some of the advertisements where it's like $5 win 500 risk free. I'm a big person on language, and I see all these things ads all over that make it seem like low cost, you get this, low risk. Like they don't say spend 5,000 to get like right. It's like $5, $10, first 50. And you did a great way of explaining to the reader how what is mentioned in those ads and what it says it's going to do doesn't always turn out that way because there's so many different uh things that you I guess agree to when you sign up for this that
Yeah.
like so I can did you learn or can you just share about that because I feel like that's such an area that we are struggling with because of all the advertising that's going on because it sounds like it's risk free when it says risk free or it says bet little you'll win a lot and there's so much that happens after that bet's made that doesn't equal what the commercial is saying. And I thought you did a great job of giving examples, saying you do this,
Yeah.
you do that, what you found. So can you share a little bit about that? Because I think that's an area that needs to be talked about more.
Yeah, because even if those promotions weren't deceitful, they might still be problematic just because dangling a freebie for something that can lead to addiction is maybe not a good idea. Giving people that false sense of how easy it is to win money, even, when you say bet $5, get 300, that might give people the impression, oh, this is a way to win money. And then from then, your expectations are distorted going forward. But the most egregious example is just these deals that use language that's totally dishonest. Risk free was everywhere for a while, and people thought it's what it says. I have no risk of losing my money. And that wasn't the case. If you read the fine print, you could absolutely risk everything you bet in $1,000 risk-free deal, or even more than that in some cases. It was brutal. And I heard from people, including former executives at these companies, who were like, yeah, that was wrong. That was dishonest. I find it satisfying a little bit to hear that, but what would be more satisfying is if people got their money back. And there was one lawyer who I wrote about in the Washington Post, and I included that in the book, where he fell for a risk-free deal in Virginia and lost $1,000 because of it. And he contested it with Virginia and with the state gaming authority. But the thing was, he was a lawyer and he worked in government, so he knew how to fight for, his cause. And ultimately, BetMGM, which was the company that he did the bet with, was prepared to give him $12,000 to make up for losing $1,000 risk-free deal, as long as he signed an NDA and didn't tell anyone what had happened. And thankfully, he took his story to me instead and gave up that payout. But I asked a state lawmaker in Virginia who had passed their bill to legalize sports betting, if this guy is going to get this huge compensation because he was tricked by a risk-free deal, shouldn't everyone get this, get a similar payoff? But he was like, yeah, that makes sense to me. And of course, that hasn't happened. But even if the industry has mostly moved off risk-free, no sweat conveys the same misleading promise. Free bets that aren't free is also deceitful. There's a lot of it, and a lot of it still goes on, and very few states have done anything about it. Ohio stands out as one of the few states that's like really put their foot down and said, we're not going to allow you to call things risk free if they're not, or free if they're not free. But by and large, anything goes in much of the country.
Yeah, yeah, I was. That's an area where I wish there'd be some action on, because I think one that, and for everybody too, but also like youth, it just a
Yeah.
lot of people also then struggling with finances, thinking this is a simple way to get out of it, and it makes it sound easy, like it makes it sound like it's not that hard. Something I wanted to ask you is there's a part of the book, and it kind of relates to the title. And I'm trying to find it as we're bringing it up, but there was something where you talk to somebody about what he thinks is going to actually lead to some change. And it wasn't the most positive things, right? So, um, it was on page 285.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of three potential disasters is likely to be the thing to do it. Either a rash of young sports bettors will commit suicide, a gambler will attempt to murder an athlete who costs them money, or a gambling-related corruption will taint a high profile sporting event. And I don't want any of those things to happen. I can imagine a lot of people that you spoke with who are similar roles like I do with counseling, prevention, and all this type of stuff. Where do you sit with something like that? That's hard to see, especially because a lot of us are seeing pedal to the metal with no guardrails.
Yeah.
And I think this is what we see is what happens when it goes off with no guardrails. Because we're seeing the scandals, and I feel like we're getting desensitized to scandals already. Like,
Right.
all of a sudden we're going to see a scandal and we're like, yeah, it's not new. So, how do you sit with that as someone that wrote this book and has been so involved in learning about this and talking about it? Where does that sit with you? That's hard.
It's disturbing. I would say the sad reality that it's in response to is just a sense that there's so much money pushing things forward. It's kind of overpowering. And advocates and health experts, it's just a kind of a David and Goliath matchup for that reason. And also with a lot of things in American life beyond gambling, just kind of like a gradual awareness that things are getting bad doesn't motivate people to take action. And that person was a psychologist at the University of New Mexico who laid out those three possibilities. I think was recognizing that it might take something that shocks the conscience of the country to enact change. Because if it's just, reports of rising addiction rates or youth gambling increasing or other things that should really trouble people, but that might not freak them out to the point that they say, enough is enough, we got to do something. Maybe it would take a disaster to actually counter all the money that's behind the endless expansion of gambling and sports betting, as dangerous as it is just the beginning. It seems like it's leading to so much more interest in gambling and so many more businesses that want to find ways of feeding that market. So, yeah, I'm not good at prognosticating, but it's sad to think that that might be what it takes.
Yeah, I know that might be something someone doesn't want to even share or talk about. So I appreciate it because I think that's to sit with the reality of what we are facing or what people are seeing. Because when those were written, I was like, yeah, that could be exactly what this could lead to, but also is that what it's going to take for more things to change in the meantime? And with, you mentioned it at the beginning because we're talking about like prediction markets, we're talking about other things that are already going on that is still changing so quickly in this landscape that for a while gambling didn't really have such acceleration and now it is almost like every day you could find out something new that's going on or something that's happening. So I feel like we could talk for hours,
Yeah,
which is
true.
it's been great. I really enjoyed your book. So I wanna ask you one more question before a final takeaway is you had a lot of experience with sports betting, journalism. You interview all these people, you dive into everything from the finances behind it, the different perspectives of those involved. Is what did you walk away with that you didn't anticipate learning by writing this book? Like for you, knowing that you had this idea of what you wanted to write about, and for a lot of people, they're going to be like, I had no clue about 98% of this stuff. Like to them, this could be a whole new everything. For you, what is it that after publishing this and now you're having people read it, you're talking to people about it, what are some of the things that stand out to you from this experience?
I mean, there's countless details that surprised me, and I think that's what makes the book engaging. Is just a lot of stuff where you're saying, "Whoa, who would never imagined that's how this works, or that's how people really talk about this." But one thing at least that seems relevant to everything we've been discussing today is was fortunate enough to speak with some people overseas, experts, researchers, even people in the gambling business, in sports in other countries. And a lot of them have dealt with the very problems that we're talking about in the US: misleading promotions, excessive advertising, youth gambling going up, the corruption of sports. All of that is familiar territory elsewhere in the world that's had sports betting much longer than it's been legal in the US. And the fact that I know this happens a lot with lawmaking in the US, but the fact that so few politicians had any curiosity to learn from those places, I think is really shameful because we're repeating a lot of the mistakes that have been made overseas and that they've been forced to reckon with. And in places like Australia and the UK, where they have real public health crises around gambling and had to crack down belatedly, they look at the US and are just like, why didn't you heed our warnings about what happens if you allow the industry to self-police? Like all of this whole playbook has been demonstrated in our countries, and the US was oblivious to that. That's so unfortunate. Another thing that's unfortunate about it is the companies that have been punished for taking advantage of people or false advertising or all these things operate in the US and are doing a lot of those same things here, even though they've faced consequences for them elsewhere. And the insight that someone told me in the UK that I think is just so applicable is the gambling business will do anything they need to make money until they're told to stop and made to stop. And that should be sobering, but it should also be motivation for politicians and voters and anyone who can influence this to say, we must step in and demand that the industry takes consumer protections and all of those things more seriously.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I imagine with all the, and it's going to continue with what you learn from it. I'm imagining this didn't get published, and you're like, all right, I did my due diligence, but you're still paying attention to a lot of
Yeah,
what's happening and what's going on.
yeah, and I'm still reporting. So if any of your, as I hope it's been clear, I try to talk to as many people as I can. If any of your listeners ever want to reach out, I'm very easy to reach. My emails put it on all my social media and my website and stuff. So I'd love to hear from people if this strikes a chord for them.
Yeah, that'd be great. So readers, he said it. So I hope someone reaches out to him because
Please.
there are those who you send an email, they'll respond. So Danny, I this has been a great conversation. So based on everything we talked about here, or anything that you want to leave as a final message for listeners, now's your time to share that.
I think one thing I appreciated, and I'm embarrassed it took me so long to learn this, is what I touched on about, what it takes for someone to develop a gambling problem and how people can be so judgmental of those people and like really look down on them as like, you asked for it, now you have to deal with it. And once you realize that it's not some moral failure that people develop addictions, I think it totally changes how you think about how the rules should be established, the guardrails that these companies should have to abide by, and also their responsibility. When we talk about responsible gambling, for one, I think we should call it responsible gambling and not responsible gaming, because not calling this gambling seems counterproductive. But to me, that's a two-way street. And yes, individuals have a responsibility to be, uh, careful and to, not do things that they know are reckless, but the companies have a responsibility too. And as I've learned about the nature of addiction and how gambling addiction is just so intense and so hard for people to overcome, it made me think differently about the standard we should hold these companies to. And I hope people who read the book come away feeling the same.
Thanks. This conversation was great. The book, I was telling you before we even started recording, that I've already recommended your book to a couple people to
Appreciate it.
learn about it. And I think it's going to be an eye opener for a lot of people, but also gives us a lot of areas and direction in which we can do some things about this. So the book is Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. Danny Funt, thanks for joining in the conversation. It was great, and looking forward to more of your work in the future.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Good speaking with you.
You've been listening to Talking Addiction and Recovery with Andrew J. Schreier. We're so glad you've joined us and invite you to connect further with the show and these topics at www.andrewjschreier.com. That's Andrew J. SCHREIER.com. You can also email us directly at talkingaddictionandrecovery@gmail.com and connect on social media, Instagram at Talking Addiction and Recovery, Facebook Talking Addiction and Recovery Podcast, and Twitter at TalkAR_podcast. To stay connected and never miss an episode, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe. Until next time, friends, let's keep talking addiction and recovery.